The sharp clang of boots against polished alloy echoed through the sterile corridors of the academy spire. Ethan Kane's stride was measured, his expression unreadable, as clusters of alien cadets whispered in tones too low for his human ears to catch. He knew their conversations well enough. He had heard them countless times. Primitive, they called him. Unrefined. Today would be no different. A Vicar cadet, his scaled skin glistening under the artificial lights, leaned against a bulkhead as Ethan approached. His amber eyes narrowed with mock amusement. "Don't trip on your primitive feet, Kane," he hissed, his words sharp and deliberate. Ethan didn't break stride, didn't react. His hands clenched subtly behind his back, the only outward sign that the taunt had landed. Let them talk, he thought. Words wouldn't change the truth, or the fact that the alien cadets had no idea what his species was capable of. The classroom dome, perched at the apex of the academy, provided an unparalleled view of the surrounding void. Stars blazed across the expanse, their brilliance undiminished by the faint haze of nearby nebulae. Ethan settled into a seat near the back, an intentional choice. He preferred to observe rather than be observed. Instructor Kraler, a towering Lyrixian with translucent quills that pulsed faintly with each movement, entered the room. His presence commanded silence. The tension in the air grew thick as he activated the holographic display, filling the room with a three-dimensional projection of Earth. "Your next assignment," Kraler began, his quills flaring briefly for emphasis, "will take you to the most unyielding world represented in this academy. A planet so hostile, it is a wonder its inhabitants achieve sentience, let alone interstellar capabilities." The cadet snickered, a ripple of disdain passing through the room like a whispered current. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain still. He had learned long ago that reacting only encouraged them. Kraler's gaze swept the room before landing squarely on Ethan. "Cadet Kane," he said, his tone dripping with the kind of civility that barely masked derision, "perhaps you can enlighten us as to how your people managed to survive such daunting odds." A flicker of laughter erupted from the front row. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "We adapted," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the laughter. "When the odds were against us, we learned how to even them." Kraler's quills stilled, his expression inscrutable. "We shall see," he said, turning back to the hologram. "Earth's history is written in the scars of its surface. You will observe these scars firsthand. Departure is in 2 cycles." The room erupted into subdued chatter as the projection shifted, displaying Earth's jagged mountain ranges and storm-lashed oceans. Ethan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the display. His world had been dismissed as a barbaric backwater for years, yet its landscapes told stories of endurance and ingenuity the aliens couldn't begin to understand. As the session ended, a Lyrixian cadet brushed past him, muttering, "Enjoy showing us your mud and rocks, human." Ethan's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Let them underestimate Earth. Let them see mud and rocks. By the time they returned, they would know exactly why humanity had earned its place in the stars. The departure to Earth was as understated as the Academy's usual dismissal of humanity. Ethan sat in the shuttle's rear section, the rigid alloy seat pressing against his back. The atmosphere buzzed faintly with tension, the sort that lingered in the presence of barely veiled disdain. The Vicar cadet from earlier lounged across the aisle, his tail flicking lazily against the floor, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Primitive transport for a primitive species," the Vicar muttered, his voice low enough to avoid the instructor's notice. Ethan glanced toward the reinforced viewport. The stars stretched endlessly, a cold backdrop to the quiet animosity in the cabin. The shuttle's interior was meticulously engineered, its panels gleaming under the sterile lighting. Yet, to the aliens, it was just another human relic. Functional, but uninspired. He focused on the shifting starlight instead of the whispers around him. A Lyrixian cadet leaned forward, his translucent quills shifting with curiosity. "Kane, is it true your people used combustion for centuries before transitioning to ion propulsion?" Ethan kept his expression neutral. We built what we needed. It worked." The Lyrixian tilted his head, the quills darkening slightly. "I wonder how you'll fare on your own planet. Harsh worlds produce harsh minds." Ethan didn't answer. The instructor's voice interrupted the exchange, sharp and commanding. "Prepare for descent. Cadets, remember, Earth's gravity will feel heavier than most of you are accustomed to. Adapt quickly or risk injury." The shuttle began its entry into Earth's atmosphere. The sudden change in pressure tightened the air, and the viewport's edges glowed faintly as friction ignited the particles outside. A slight vibration passed through the cabin, an undeniable reminder of their rapid descent. Ethan watched the planet's surface come into focus, a vast expanse of jagged peaks and sprawling forests, alive with shifting clouds and streaks of light that hinted at bustling cities below. As the shuttle pierced the clouds, the temperature inside shifted subtly. The faint coolness of recycled air gave way to the natural warmth radiating from the surface. The engines adjusted, their tone deepening as the shuttle decelerated with calculated precision. Below, the landing zone came into view, a sprawling compound framed by rugged cliffs and dense greenery. To the aliens, it was likely just another crude facility. To Ethan, it was home, a place that bore the scars of Earth's relentless trials and triumphs. The shuttle touched down with a low, steady thud, the landing struts digging slightly into the compacted soil. The ramp extended, hissing faintly as it made contact with the ground. Ethan inhaled deeply as he stepped outside. The air was sharp and bracing, carrying the scent of damp stone and pine needles. The uneven terrain beneath his boots contrasted starkly with the smooth flooring of the academy. One of the Vicar cadets stumbled slightly as he stepped off the ramp. "Thicker air, heavier pull. Feels like I'm dragging weights." Ethan smirked faintly. "Welcome to Earth. You'll adapt." He turned toward the compound, his stride unbroken as the alien cadets hesitated behind him. They would learn soon enough. On this world, adaptation wasn't a choice. It was survival. Ethan led the group down the uneven path, the soles of his boots pressing into the soft earth with each deliberate step. The compound loomed ahead, its walls carved into the base of a jagged cliff. The structure wasn't polished or graceful. It was built to endure. Dark stone reinforced with metal plating gave it a rugged appearance, like a fortress defying the elements. Overhead, clouds churned sluggishly, the sun occasionally piercing through to paint the ground in fleeting golden patches. Behind him, the alien cadets moved hesitantly, their movement stiff under Earth's gravity. The Vicar stumbled once more, his tail dragging limply in the dirt. "Your planet is suffocating," he muttered, his voice rasping as if the denser air weighed on his lungs. Ethan didn't slow his pace. "It's invigorating," he replied without turning. His tone was clipped, his focus unbroken. The scent of damp moss and iron-rich soil clung to the air, mingling with the sharp tang of metal that emanated faintly from the compound's defenses. As they neared the entrance, the low murmur of distant machinery became audible, a rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat beneath the ground. Ethan's gaze flicked to the concealed turrets that tracked their approach with cold precision. The alien cadets noticed them too, their wide-eyed stares betraying unease. "Are those active?" one Lyrixian asked, his translucent quills vibrating faintly. Ethan allowed a small smile. "Always." The reinforced gate slid open with a grinding groan, revealing the interior of the compound. A blast of warmth greeted them, tinged with the faint scent of heated metal and sterilized surfaces. Inside, the atmosphere was an unsettling mix of calculated efficiency and raw practicality. Walls were lined with heavy equipment, their surfaces worn and pitted from constant use. Lights cast harsh white beams, illuminating every detail without mercy. "Cadet Kane," a deep voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. Ethan turned to face an older man in a dark uniform. His face was weathered like stone shaped by years of storms. "Colonel Halstead." The man's eyes locked onto Ethan with an intensity that seemed to bore through the air. "I see you've brought our guests." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, his voice steady. The colonel's gaze swept over the alien cadets, lingering just long enough to make each of them shift uncomfortably. "Welcome to Earth," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Here, we don't cater to comfort. You're here to observe, not to be coddled. Keep that in mind." The Vicar hissed softly under his breath, earning a sharp glance from the colonel. "Problem?" the man asked, his tone daring the alien to respond. "No, sir," the Vicar muttered, looking away. Ethan suppressed a smirk as Halstead turned and gestured for them to follow. The corridor led deeper into the compound, the walls narrowing and the air growing warmer. Faint vibrations coursed through the floor, a constant reminder of the facility's restless activity. Halstead stopped before a heavy door. "This," he said, gripping the handle, "is where Earth's ingenuity thrives. Let's see if your peaceful ideals can stomach it." He yanked the door open, revealing a sprawling command center. Holographic maps pulsed with data, red markers blinking ominously. Alien cadets murmured uneasily, their confidence cracking under the weight of the unknown. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes scanning the display. The stakes had just become clearer and much, much higher. The room pulsed with a quiet intensity, the holographic maps casting ghostly colors across the walls. Red markers blinked on the display, scattered like drops of blood on a battlefield. The air felt taut, thick with unspoken tension. Colonel Halstead stepped forward, his boots striking the metal floor with a deliberate cadence that resonated through the chamber. He pointed to the largest cluster of signals, his voice razor-sharp. "That," he said, "is your first lesson in Earth's reality. They've entered our orbit." Ethan's gaze hardened, his chest tightening as he studied the display. The markers moved with eerie synchronization, an unnatural rhythm that sent a shiver up his spine. The alien cadets clustered behind him, their curiosity now tainted with unease. One Lyrixian quilled his translucent mane nervously. "What are those?" Halstead's expression darkened. "Uninvited guests, biomechanical life forms. They call themselves the Swarm." He glanced at the alien cadets, his tone cutting. "They're what happens when survival doesn't come with morality." The Vicar cadet scoffed, attempting to mask his apprehension. "They're just machines. Surely, our coalition tech can neutralize them." Halstead's lips curled into a humorless smirk. "Machines don't think. These do. And they adapt. Every weapon, every tactic you throw at them becomes their advantage." A sharp crackling interrupted him as the room's communication console lit up. A human officer, her uniform bearing the marks of hasty preparation, appeared on the feed. "Colonel, Sector 6 reports breach attempts at the outer perimeter. They're testing for weaknesses." Halstead nodded, his focus unshaken. "Double the automated patrols. Deploy sentry drones to vulnerable zones. Do not engage until I give the order." Ethan watched as Halstead's commands rippled across the room, officers moving with precision like pieces in a well-rehearsed play. The tension in the air sharpened, every breath carrying the weight of impending conflict. He stepped closer to the map, his voice calm but edged. "How many do you estimate?" "Too many," Halstead replied. His eyes flicked to Ethan, and for the first time there was a glimmer of something other than command in his gaze. "Your guests will learn quickly what it means to stand on Earth." The compound shuddered faintly as distant impacts rippled through the ground. A Vicar cadet flinched, his tail curling instinctively. "What was that?" "Initial probes," Halstead replied. "They're feeling us out, testing where we're weakest." Ethan straightened, his gaze steady. "They'll find out the hard way that we don't break easily." The colonel's expression softened slightly, a shadow of approval flickering behind his hardened eyes. "Let's hope your guests can keep up." A siren wailed through the compound, its rising pitch laced with urgency. Officers moved with brisk determination, the weight of preparation palpable. Ethan led the alien cadets toward an observation deck where the ground defenses roared to life below. Automated turrets pivoted with mechanical precision, their barrels glowing faintly as they powered up. Sentry drones hovered like predators, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The first swarm ships broke through the low-hanging clouds, their sleek alien forms glinting dully in the dim light. They moved like shadows, weaving and twisting as though alive. Ethan felt a jolt of adrenaline, his senses sharpening as he watched them descend. Halstead's voice echoed behind him, sharp as steel. "Welcome to Earth's hospitality. I hope you're ready." The air vibrated with tension, the first shots blazing across the battlefield like cracks of thunder in a storm. The sky over the compound erupted with bursts of searing light as Earth's defenses engaged the descending swarm. Beams of concentrated energy lanced upward, slicing through the air like a blade through silk. Explosions rippled across the clouds, their fiery embers raining down in fleeting, glowing arcs. The ground trembled with each impact, an almost rhythmic vibration coursing through the metal deck of the observation platform. Ethan's heart thudded against his ribs as he tracked the swarm's movements. Their ships twisted and spiraled unnaturally, moving in patterns that defied logic. They weren't simply avoiding the defensive fire. They were studying it, adjusting, and improving. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down like a rising tide, each second bringing the enemy closer. Beside him, the Vicar cadet pressed a hand to his scaled chest, his breathing shallow. "They're learning," he muttered, his amber eyes fixed on the chaos above. His tail flicked once, betraying his mounting unease. Ethan glanced at him briefly before turning his gaze back to the battlefield. "Welcome to the swarm," he said evenly, the words heavier than he intended. He could see the lines of doubt etched on the faces of the alien cadets. They weren't ready for this. Not yet. Behind them, Colonel Halstead's voice cut through the tension like a whip. "All ground units, initiate Phase 2. Keep them outside the perimeter at all costs." The colonel's orders echoed through the chamber as a flurry of activity erupted below. Sentry drones swept low over the terrain, their sensors glowing like cold stars as they locked onto targets. Automated turrets pivoted with mechanical precision, their rapid-fire bursts lighting the compound in a strobe of orange and white. The swarm retaliated, their projectiles slamming into the defenses with a deafening roar. Shards of molten metal rained down, sizzling against the damp earth. One of the Lyrixian cadets leaned closer to Ethan, his quills trembling faintly. "How does Earth withstand this? Your weapons are advanced, but the swarm, they seem endless." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on a section of the battlefield where the swarm ships had begun to cluster, their movements growing more erratic. It wasn't random. There was a purpose behind the chaos. "It's not about the weapons," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "It's about how we think." "What do you mean?" the Lyrixian pressed, his voice tight. Ethan didn't answer. His attention was drawn to the holographic map inside the observation room, where a new cluster of red markers was beginning to take shape. They were moving with a deliberate, almost predatory rhythm, converging on a single point near the western perimeter. His stomach tightened. "What are they doing?" the Vicar cadet asked, his voice edging toward panic. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "They're not just attacking. They're setting something up." He turned sharply to Halstead. "Colonel, they're concentrating near the west. It's a diversion." Halstead's gaze snapped to the map, his jaw tightening. "Damn it! They're probing for our blind spots." He turned to his officers. "Reinforce the west now." The mystery of the swarm's intent deepened as the battle raged on, their calculated movements hinting at something far more sinister than a simple attack. Ethan's mind raced, but the answer remained elusive, just out of reach. The ground quaked again, and he knew one thing for certain. The real danger hadn't even begun to reveal itself. The compound vibrated with urgency, the air electric with overlapping orders, and the heavy cadence of boots against steel. Ethan's eyes flicked between the holographic map and the chaos unfolding outside. The western perimeter glowed ominously on the display, the cluster of swarm forces moving like rippling ink, each ship darting with the precision of a predator stalking prey. "Reinforcements are moving into position, sir," an officer called from the command console, her fingers flying across the interface. "But they're fast, too fast." "They're not just fast," Ethan muttered, his gaze sharpening. "They're intentional." He leaned closer to the map, following the path of the swarm's maneuvers. Their patterns weren't just adaptive, they were predictive. They were testing the compound's defenses, their movements like fingers brushing against weak points in a wall. "They're playing with us," Halstead barked. "Enough speculation. What do you see, Kane?" Ethan straightened, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "They're forcing us to shift our resources west. The moment we do, they'll strike somewhere else, probably the north. It's classic misdirection." Halstead's jaw tightened, his sharp gaze locked on Ethan. "And your solution?" "Keep reinforcing the west," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But deploy covert teams to the northern perimeter, hidden, ready to ambush. Let them think they've outsmarted us." The colonel studied him for a long moment before nodding sharply. "Do it! Lieutenant Harris, move your unit north and keep it dark. No signals, no movement until they engage." As orders crackled through the room, the alien cadets exchanged uneasy glances. One Lyrixian spoke up, his quills shimmering faintly. "Your tactics, they seem reckless. A gamble." Ethan turned to him, his voice measured but firm. "Survival isn't about certainty. It's about adapting faster than your enemy." The Lyrixian hesitated, his quills dimming as he processed the words. The Vicar, however, snorted dismissively. "Human bravado. Let's see how far it gets us." Outside, the western defenses unleashed a barrage of concentrated fire, cutting through the waves of advancing swarm ships. The air crackled with the searing heat of plasma bursts and the staccato rhythm of kinetic rounds. The vibrations underfoot grew stronger, a constant reminder of the battle's ferocity. Ethan's focus shifted back to the holographic map, where he caught the first flicker of movement in the north. A single red marker blinked into existence, followed by another, then a dozen more. His stomach tightened. "They're here." "North perimeter breached," a voice shouted over the comms. Halstead's voice rang out like a hammer. "Lieutenant Harris, engage!" The map exploded with activity as hidden units sprang to life, catching the swarm in a deadly crossfire. The cadets behind Ethan leaned forward, their breaths caught in their throats as they watched the ambush unfold. The battle raged, but Ethan's eyes remained on the display, scanning for what was missing. The swarm's behavior felt too deliberate, too controlled. His chest tightened as a chilling thought gripped him. "This isn't it," he whispered, barely audible. "This is still just the beginning." Halstead overheard, his expression hardening. "Explain." Ethan's voice dropped, his words slow and deliberate. "They're probing us, yes, but this isn't their full force. They're waiting for something. A trigger." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm cloud about to break. Outside, the battlefield glowed with fury, but inside, the greater mystery loomed, unanswered and growing. The battlefield outside the compound simmered under a haze of scorched air and ash. The distant glow of fire streaked the darkening horizon, casting distorted shadows on the observation deck. Inside, the tension was suffocating, each second ticking away like a fuse running low. Ethan's mind churned, replaying the swarm's calculated attacks, their movements impossibly efficient yet deliberate, like a master chess player biding their time. Colonel Halstead paced the room, his expression carved from granite, eyes darting between the holographic map and his officers. "Status report," he snapped, his voice a whip cracking through the room. "North perimeter secured, sir," an officer replied. "But their assault patterns are shifting again, deeper, tighter formations. They're not retreating, they're consolidating." "They're baiting us," Ethan muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on the display. The clusters of red markers pulsed like a malignant growth, their movements impossibly coordinated. Halstead caught the remark, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Speak up, Kane. You have a theory?" Ethan straightened, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "They're not fighting to win right now. They're testing how far they can push us. They're learning our thresholds, waiting for us to overextend." One of the Vicar cadets scoffed, his tail twitching. "Waiting for what? Their forces are already overwhelming. Why hold back?" Ethan turned to him, his words as sharp as a blade. "Because overwhelming isn't enough. They don't want victory. They want dominance. They're studying us, so when they strike for real, we won't stand a chance." The alien cadet's mocking expression faltered, replaced by unease. Behind him, the Lyrixian quills trembled faintly, catching the dim light like shards of glass. "If they're waiting," the Lyrixian asked hesitantly, "what are they waiting for?" Ethan glanced back at the map, the clusters of red shifting subtly, like predators circling unseen prey. Something we haven't seen yet. Outside, the distant rumble of explosions intensified, shaking the observation deck under their feet. The harsh light of weapon fire illuminated the compound in sporadic bursts, revealing soldiers moving with frantic purpose. The smell of burnt soil mingled with the metallic tang of heated machinery, clinging to the air like an invisible weight. "South perimeter breach," a voice crackled through the comms. "Multiple signatures inbound. Larger than before." Halstead's jaw clenched. "Redirect units to the south. Full defensive spread." Ethan's stomach dropped as he studied the new markers on the map. They were massive, far larger than anything the swarm had deployed so far. His voice cut through the din. "That's it. That's their real force." Halstead's eyes snapped to Ethan, his tone laced with urgency. "Explain." "They've been pushing us toward this," Ethan said, his voice low but intense. "Testing our limits, making us react. Now they're going to hit us where it hurts." The room grew silent, the weight of realization settling over the group. The Lyrixian cadet whispered, his voice trembling, "If this is their real force, how do we stop them?" Ethan stared at the map, his hands curling into fists. "We don't play their game. We make them play ours." The words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope against the tide of uncertainty. Outside, the shadows deepened, the swarm's true intent still veiled, but their presence loomed like a storm waiting to break. The air inside the command center was heavy with anticipation, each breath carrying the unspoken tension of those waiting for something to break. The holographic map dominated the room, glowing faintly as the massive swarm formations in the south grew denser. Every red marker pulsing on the display felt like a heartbeat, rhythmic and inevitable. Ethan's mind raced, his eyes fixed on the shifting clusters. Each movement told a story, how the swarm advanced, consolidated, and adapted. The realization gnawed at him. Their tactics weren't instinctive. They were deliberate. He could almost feel the weight of a calculating mind behind their every move. Colonel Halstead's voice shattered the silence. "Suggestions, Kane?" "You said we make them play our game. What's the play?" Ethan straightened, his gaze snapping to the colonel. "We turn their strength into a liability. They rely on coordination. Everything they do hinges on centralized control. We disrupt it." The Vicar cadet scoffed, the sharp flick of his tail betraying his nerves. "You want to disrupt them? They're outmaneuvering every defense we throw at them." Ethan didn't flinch. His voice was firm, like steel hammered into shape. "That's because we're reacting. If we go offensive, we dictate the terms." Halstead's brow furrowed as he studied the young cadet. "How do you propose we disrupt something we don't fully understand?" Ethan leaned closer to the map, pointing at the densest cluster of swarm markers. "They're protecting something here. It's their anchor, the source of their coordination. We hit that, and we force them to fall apart." The Lyrixian cadet stepped forward hesitantly, his quills shimmering faintly under the light. "But how do we get close? Their formation is impenetrable." Ethan turned toward him, his voice lowering as if the weight of his words carried a warning. "We don't go through it. We make them come to us." Outside, the battle intensified. The muffled roar of artillery fire seeped through the reinforced walls, each blast resonating like a distant drumbeat. Ethan's eyes flicked to the observation window, where streaks of fire lit up the horizon. The swarm ships loomed larger now, their shadowy forms twisting unnaturally as they evaded ground fire. "We'll feint an evacuation," Ethan said, turning back to Halstead. "Make them think we're pulling back to regroup. They'll move to capitalize, thinning their defenses around the core. That's when we strike." Halstead's jaw tightened as he processed the plan. "And if they don't take the bait?" "They will," Ethan replied. "They've been pushing us to break. They won't resist the chance to finish it." A grim silence settled over the room as Halstead nodded. "Make it happen. I want every unit briefed and ready to move in 30 minutes. The alien cadets exchanged uneasy glances, their doubt hanging in the air like static. Ethan ignored them, his focus unshaken as he approached the map. His fingers hovered over the central cluster, the largest red mass pulsating ominously. His voice was quiet but resolute. "We don't outlast them," he murmured. "We outthink them." As the room erupted into motion, orders being relayed and plans set into motion, Ethan felt the familiar churn of uncertainty in his gut. The swarm's true strength was still shrouded, but one thing was certain. This battle would test the limits of everything they thought they knew. The control room thrummed with a nervous energy as the final preparations for the feint were underway. Ethan stood by the holographic map, watching the markers pulse like a malevolent heartbeat. Every movement of the swarm mirrored precision, their intent as focused as the blade of a hunter. His plan was in motion, but the weight of its outcome bore down on him like a gathering storm. Colonel Halstead's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "Evacuation signals active. Units are falling back as ordered." He turned to Ethan, his expression a mixture of skepticism and determination. "If this fails, Kane, we won't get another chance." "It won't fail," Ethan replied, his gaze never leaving the map. His voice carried an edge, but beneath it was a flicker of doubt he refused to let show. The swarm was watching, waiting for weakness, and they couldn't afford to offer any. Outside, the compound was alive with movement. Troops streamed toward the evacuation shuttles in staggered lines, their boots striking the ground with relentless rhythm. The air vibrated with the hum of drones darting through the smoke-laden sky, their scanners casting pale green beams across the chaotic landscape. The acrid tang of scorched earth mingled with the metallic scent of overheated machinery, creating an atmosphere thick with urgency. The alien cadets had been stationed in the observation deck, their wide eyes betraying their unease. The Lyrixian cadet, his quills dimmed to a muted gray, approached Ethan cautiously. "You're gambling everything on this ruse," he said, his voice low and taut. "What if they see through it?" "They won't," Ethan replied, his tone clipped. He gestured to the map, where red markers began shifting, the swarm tightening their formations around the evacuation corridors. "They've been pushing us toward collapse. This is exactly what they've been waiting for. They'll believe it." The Lyrixian hesitated, his translucent quills shivering faintly. "And if they don't?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his voice dropping. "Then we make them." As if on cue, a fresh wave of swarm ships breached the lower atmosphere. Their shapes, sleek and predatory, reflected the dim firelight of the battlefield below. They moved like shadows, twisting through the defensive fire with an almost liquid grace. Ethan watched their approach, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. This was the moment of truth. The evacuation transports began their ascent, their engines blazing trails through the smoky sky. The swarm responded instantly, their formations shifting to intercept. Ethan felt a flicker of satisfaction as he observed their movements, exactly as he'd predicted. But his focus sharpened as a smaller cluster of ships broke away, heading directly for the decoy shuttles stationed at the edge of the perimeter. "There," he said, pointing to the display. "That's their weak spot. That's where they've committed their command ships. If we hit them now," Halstead nodded curtly. "Strike teams are already in position. On your mark." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his chest tightening as he considered the stakes. "Wait for it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye locked on the map. The red markers converged, the swarm pressing forward with reckless intensity. Ethan's hand shot forward. "Now." The room erupted into motion, commands echoing through the control center as strike teams engaged. Explosions lit the horizon like fireworks, and for a brief moment, the swarm's perfect coordination faltered. But even as the tide seemed to shift, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle had yet to begin. Something was still out there, waiting, watching. The explosions outside painted the sky in chaotic bursts of orange and red, each detonation sending shockwaves through the air. Dust rained from the ceiling of the command center as the floor vibrated beneath their feet. Ethan's eyes remained locked on the holographic map, where the swarm's movements flickered with unsettling precision. The strike teams had landed their blow, but the response from the enemy was immediate and calculated. "Southwestern flank is collapsing," an officer called out, her voice strained. "The swarm is concentrating firepower. Our units are falling back." Ethan clenched his jaw, his gaze flicking to the cluster of red markers surging against the outer defenses. The swarm didn't falter. They adapted. Their ships moved like a tide, surging into gaps before they could close, each motion perfectly synchronized. It was like watching a predator circle its prey, knowing the kill was only a matter of time. "They're shifting tactics again," Ethan muttered, his voice low but sharp. He traced the swarm's movements with his finger, his mind working furiously. "They're trying to isolate our forward units. If they break through—" "Don't state the obvious, Kane," Halstead snapped, his tone cutting but not unkind. "Tell me what to do." Ethan inhaled deeply, forcing himself to focus. The weight of the moment pressed down like a physical force, but he pushed it aside. "Pull the forward units back into the secondary line, tighten the formation, force them into a choke point. We can bottle them up and concentrate fire." Halstead didn't hesitate. "You heard him. Get it done." Orders crackled across the comms as officers relayed the commands. Outside, the battlefield shifted like a living organism. Earth's forces began a calculated retreat, their movements swift but precise. The alien cadets in the observation deck watched in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of awe and unease. The Lyrixian cadet stepped closer to Ethan, his voice barely above a whisper. "You make it sound so simple, but they're unstoppable." "They're not unstoppable," Ethan replied, his voice steely. "They're predictable. They react to patterns, and that's their flaw. We force them into situations where they don't have time to adapt." The Lyrixian fell silent, his quills dimming as he processed the words. Outside, the swarm pushed harder, their ships weaving through defensive fire with relentless precision. Ethan watched as the red markers began to pile up at the choke point he'd identified. His chest tightened. It was working, but just barely. A sudden shift on the map caught his attention. A new cluster of markers appeared on the far side of the battlefield, moving with alarming speed. Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized their intent. "They're flanking us," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "They're splitting their forces, trying to encircle the compound." Halstead's gaze snapped to the map, his expression grim. "Can we counter?" Ethan's mind raced, the seconds dragging like hours. "Not directly. We don't have the resources to hold both flanks. But if we bait them again, make them overcommit—" "Another gamble," the Vicar cadet muttered, his tail flicking in irritation. "Survival is a gamble," Ethan shot back, his eyes flashing. "You play to win, or you lose everything." The room fell into a tense silence as the weight of his words settled over them. Outside, the battle raged on, the swarm pressing harder with every passing moment. Ethan's plan was working, but the enemy was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. He could feel it in his bones. This was only the beginning of their true test. The battlefield outside surged with chaos, the swarm's assault intensifying as their forces pressed the flanking maneuver. Ethan's eyes darted across the holographic map, his mind parsing each movement with rapid precision. The red markers on the edges of the display crept inward like claws closing around the compound. The air in the command center felt charged, thick with the weight of too many possibilities and not enough certainties. Colonel Halstead's voice sliced through the tension. "Status on the secondary defenses?" "Shields at 40%, an officer replied, her tone tight. "The outermost sentry units are gone. They've broken through the first barrier." Halstead's jaw set in a grim line. "Kane, you've got about 30 seconds to tell me how we don't end up in the history books as a cautionary tale." Ethan leaned closer to the map, his focus narrowing. He traced the swarm's pincer-like movement with his finger, his mind spinning through options. "They're overextending," he said suddenly, his voice firm. "They're committing too many resources to the flanks, leaving their center exposed." The Vicar cadet stepped forward, his tail flicking with skepticism. "Exposed?" "That center is a wall of ships twice the size of anything we've faced so far." Ethan turned to him, his gaze piercing. Size doesn't matter if it's brittle. Their strength relies on coordination. If we punch through the center, their flanks won't matter. They'll collapse. The Lyrixian cadet spoke, his quills glimmering faintly. And how exactly do you intend to punch through something that's adaptive by design? Ethan didn't flinch. We force them to adapt faster than they can handle. Hit them with everything we've got. Unpredictable patterns, overlapping strikes. We overwhelm their processing. Halstead considered this, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the map. And the flanks? We bait them again, Ethan said, his voice steady. Deploy decoys to draw their fire. It'll buy us enough time to focus on the core. The colonel nodded sharply. You heard him. Get the decoys deployed. I want the artillery focused on the central formation. This is our shot. The command center erupted into motion as officers relayed orders. Outside, the defensive turrets pivoted with mechanical precision, unleashing a fresh barrage toward the swarm's core. Decoy drones launched into the air, their glowing hulls mimicking troop transports as they darted toward the flanks. Ethan watched the map as the red markers shifted, the swarm's forces reacting exactly as he predicted. The compound trembled under the force of another impact, a sharp crack echoing through the walls. The smell of overheated circuits mingled with the sharp tang of scorched debris. Ethan's heart pounded as he monitored the assault, the stakes pressing against him like a physical weight. Halstead's voice broke through the noise. Artillery impact in the core. Status? An officer glanced up, her expression taut. Direct hits confirmed. Their formation is destabilizing. Ethan exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. But even as the swarm's center wavered, a new marker appeared on the map. A single, massive signature moving toward the battlefield. His stomach dropped. What the hell is that? Halstead muttered. Ethan's voice was low, almost a whisper. It's what they've been protecting. The room fell silent, the realization settling over them like a shadow. Outside, the horizon glowed with fire, but the true danger was only now revealing itself. Whatever was coming, it would be unlike anything they had faced before. The horizon burned with streaks of fiery orange, the sky choked with smoke that seemed to ripple as distant explosions shook the battlefield. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the holographic map as the massive new signature crept closer, each pulse of its marker resonating like the toll of a bell. It was vast, far larger than anything the swarm had revealed so far, and its trajectory was direct, unyielding. Magnify that, Colonel Halstead barked, his tone betraying the unease that even he couldn't mask. The display zoomed in, revealing a construct that seemed to defy logic. It wasn't a single ship, but a sprawling amalgamation of vessels and biomechanical structures fused together. Organic spines jutted out like grotesque spears, pulsing faintly with an unnatural energy. It moved with deliberate slowness, as though fully aware of the terror it commanded. That's what they've been guarding, Ethan said, his voice low but certain. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest, as though the construct's mere presence had a gravity of its own. Halstead's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. What's its purpose? It's not moving like a standard assault force. Ethan stared at the pulsating mass, his mind racing. The swarm wasn't reckless. Every move was deliberate, strategic. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't here to simply attack. It's central to their coordination, he said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke. It's not just their strongest weapon. It's their mind. The Vicar cadet hissed softly, his tail curling with tension. You mean it's controlling them? Halstead nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm. What about the breach itself? How do you get through that armor? Ethan gestured to the projection, his finger tracing the organic spines lining the construct's hull. These spines are the key. They're conduits, drawing power from the core to its defenses. If we overload one, it'll create a localized breach, enough to get a team inside. Halstead's jaw tightened. What do you need? Targeted plasma charges, Ethan said. Precise deployment. Anything too big risks damaging the interior, and us along with it. The colonel gave a sharp nod, turning to his officers. Prepare the charges. Kane, you'll lead the strike team. Ethan's stomach twisted at the weight of the assignment, but he straightened, his voice resolute. Understood. The Lyrixian cadet stepped forward hesitantly. I'll go. Someone needs to monitor the systems once we're inside. The Vicar rolled his eyes, but stepped forward as well. And someone has to keep you both alive. Ethan glanced at them briefly, then back to Halstead. We'll need cover until we're close enough to breach. The colonel's eyes gleamed with determination. You'll get it. We'll throw everything we have at that thing. Ethan nodded, his pulse steady despite the storm swirling around him. Then let's move. As the team dispersed to prepare, Ethan stood alone for a moment, his gaze fixed on the glowing construct. The plan was bold, dangerous, but it was their only chance. Outside, the battle raged on, the swarm's movements growing more erratic as the construct loomed closer. The time for planning was over. Now, it was time to act. The strike team moved through the preparation bay, their steps deliberate as they fastened combat gear and checked their equipment. The air was tense but focused, filled with the muted clicks of locking mechanisms and the hiss of pressurized seals on suits. Ethan secured the last of his armor, his gaze flicking to the plasma charges arranged in a compact satchel at his side. Each device was calibrated to deliver precise bursts, enough to penetrate the construct's hull without risking an uncontrolled breach. Colonel Halstead's voice came through the comms, steady but weighted. Kane, the distraction force is ready to engage. You'll have a 15-minute window before the swarm redirects. Ethan nodded sharply, his voice calm despite the pressure. Understood. We'll make it count. The Lyrixian cadet approached, his quills pulsing faintly as he checked the scanner module strapped to his forearm. If their interceptors detect us, we're done. Are you sure this stealth tech will hold? It'll hold, Ethan replied, tightening the straps on his helmet. They'll be too focused on the decoys to notice us slipping through. The Vicar cadet, securing his weapon, let out a low hiss. If it doesn't, I hope you've planned for that too. Ethan turned to face him, his voice edged but even. We adapt. That's the plan. Outside the compound, the swarm's forces shifted like a living wave, their patterns tightening around the massive construct as it inched closer to the heart of Earth's defenses. Ethan and his team stepped into the launch bay, the faint vibration of nearby artillery fire thrumming through the walls. The stealth craft awaited them, its angular design sleek and unassuming, its hull coated in a reflective material that shimmered faintly under the bay lights. Board up, Ethan commanded, his voice firm but low. The team moved swiftly, each step precise as they entered the vessel and secured themselves in the tight quarters. The interior was Spartan, with only the essential displays glowing softly against the dull gray walls. The pilot gave a brief nod, his hands dancing over the controls as the hatch sealed behind them. The craft lifted with a faint whine, its stabilizers adjusting as it slipped into the night sky. Through the narrow viewport, the battlefield below unfolded like a grim tableau, streaks of light from artillery fire, the jagged glow of explosions against the earth, and the looming shadow of the construct. Ethan could feel the subtle shifts in the craft's trajectory as it wove through the chaos, the pilot keeping them just outside the swarm's detection range. Approaching target, the pilot murmured, his voice tight. Ethan glanced at the scanner feed, watching as the construct's pulsating form grew larger. The spines along its hull glowed faintly, a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost alive. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his chest, a reminder of the stakes. Decoys are engaging, Halstead's voice came over the comms. They're taking the bait. You're clear. Ethan turned to his team, his voice steady. This is it. No hesitation. Stick to the plan and we'll make it back. The Lyrixian nodded, his quills shimmering faintly. The Vicar grunted, his grip tightening on his weapon. The craft shuddered as it began its final approach, the glow of the construct's spines bathing the cabin in an eerie light. As the craft latched onto the construct's surface, Ethan's pulse quickened. The breach charges were ready, the countdown to their most dangerous move yet ticking away in his mind. The strike team braced as the stealth craft locked onto the construct with a muted hiss. The The soft vibration of the craft against the alien hull thrummed through their boots, a tangible reminder of where they were. Ethan moved swiftly, setting the plasma charges along the designated breach points with practiced efficiency. The Lyrixian cadet hovered nearby, monitoring the fluctuating energy readings on his scanner. The Vicar stood at the rear, his sharp eyes fixed on the dark, organic surface around them. Ethan's voice was a razor's edge. "Charges set. Detonation in 10. The Lyrixian's quills shimmered faintly. "Readings are spiking. It knows we're here." "Good," Ethan replied, his tone clipped. "Let it watch. It can't stop us." At the 10-second mark, the charges detonated in a synchronized burst. The shockwave rippled through the construct's hull, splintering the organic material and exposing a pulsating interior of veins and conduits. The breach glowed faintly, a wound in the construct's seemingly impenetrable armor. "Move!" Ethan barked, leading the team into the breach. The air inside was humid and charged, a subtle tingle brushing against their skin as the construct's interior pulsed around them. Organic walls throbbed in rhythmic waves, each one carrying an unsettling warmth that felt alive. "Quills up," the Vicar muttered, his weapon raised. "This place feels wrong." Ethan's focus remained unbroken. "Stay sharp. We're heading for the core." The Lyrixian scanned the twisting corridors, his voice tight. "It's shifting. The pathways are changing as we move." "They're trying to trap us," Ethan said, his tone cold. "Stick to the scanner. Keep adjusting." Deeper into the construct, the pulse of energy grew stronger, each wave resonating through the air like an unspoken warning. The team's boots squelched against the slick surface beneath them, the texture shifting with every step. The Lyrixian stumbled briefly but caught himself, his face pale. "They're here," the Vicar said, his voice low. Ahead, the corridor opened into a vast chamber. Biomechanical drones hung suspended from the walls, their movements eerily synchronized as they turned toward the intruders. Ethan's grip on his weapon tightened. "Hold position," he ordered. "Take them out fast. No wasted shots." The first drone lunged, its limbs slicing through the air with unnatural speed. Ethan fired, his plasma round striking the creature's core and reducing it to molten shards. The Lyrixian and Vicar followed suit, their weapons blazing as they held their ground. The chamber trembled as the last drone fell, its remains smoldering against the floor. Beyond them, a central node pulsed with an intense light, its surface a shifting amalgamation of organic and synthetic components. It was the heart of the construct, the brain controlling the swarm. Ethan's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of everything they'd fought for. "That's it. Plant the charges." As the charges were armed, the Lyrixian glanced at Ethan. "Do you think they'll understand why we did this?" Ethan's gaze was steady. "They'll understand when they see what we've protected." The charges detonated, and the chamber erupted in a brilliant cascade of light and fire, the construct's core collapsing under the weight of its own failure. Outside, the swarm faltered, their perfect coordination unraveling. Humanity had turned the tide not by superior technology, but by being what they always were, adaptable, unyielding, and fiercely protective of their home. The construct's collapse was an explosion of light and motion, a wave of energy rippling outward as the core detonated. Ethan and the strike team sprinted through the twisting corridors, their boots pounding against the shifting surface beneath them. The walls trembled violently, organic spines splintering and falling as the entire structure began to disintegrate. Heat pressed against their backs, pushing them forward as the construct's death throes threatened to consume everything inside. "Keep moving!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His lungs burned as he led the team toward the breach they had created. The Lyrixian cadet stumbled, but righted himself, his quills dim and twitching with exhaustion. The Vicar was close behind, his tail lashing with tension as he fired into the shadows, keeping the remaining drones at bay. Through the breach, the stealth craft waited, its hull glowing faintly from the heat of the collapsing structure. The pilot's voice crackled through the comms. "You've got 60 seconds before this thing goes supernova. Get on board now." Ethan pushed the Lyrixian forward, then turned to cover their escape. The Vicar stopped at the edge of the breach, his eyes narrowing as he stared back into the crumbling depths. "We should have died in there." "But we didn't," Ethan replied sharply, grabbing his arm and pulling him onto the craft. "Move!" The hatch sealed behind them with a heavy clang, and the craft's engines roared to life, propelling them away from the disintegrating construct. Through the viewport, Ethan watched as the massive structure collapsed inward, its spines snapping like brittle bones before it imploded in a burst of brilliant energy. The shockwave rolled outward, dissipating as it reached the edges of the battlefield. Silence fell in the cabin, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. The Lyrixian looked at Ethan, his quills shimmering faintly with disbelief. "It worked. We actually did it." The Vicar leaned back, his gaze distant. "The swarm fell apart, just like you said." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was watching the battlefield below, where the remnants of the swarm moved erratically, their coordination shattered. Earth's forces pressed forward, reclaiming ground inch by inch as the tide of battle turned. Halstead's voice came through the comms, low and steady. "Kane, the swarm is breaking. You've done your part. Get back here." Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. He turned to his team, his voice firm but softer now. "We're not finished. Not until every last one of them is gone." The Lyrixian nodded, his exhaustion replaced with quiet determination. The Vicar said nothing, but the flicker of respect in his eyes was enough. As the craft descended toward the command center, Ethan's thoughts drifted. The swarm had underestimated them, mistaking Earth's resolve for recklessness, its adaptability for chaos. The aliens aboard the craft had mocked humanity, but now they had witnessed its unyielding spirit firsthand. As they landed, the Vicar muttered, almost to himself, "For a Death Worlder, you're not what I expected." Ethan glanced at him, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe it's time to stop expecting anything from us. That's what makes us human." The title, etched in the collective memory of everyone who saw Earth fight, would not be forgotten. Humans were not just survivors. They were protectors, defenders of life even in the face of overwhelming odds. And this was their home, standing strong.